to my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm going to be talking about this year's Best Novel Hugo nominees. I have read all of them this year. Whoa! I think this is the only category on this year's ballot where I actually read all the nominees. I did read like quite a lot from the other categories, but I didn't read everything in any of the other categories. So this is my review and wrap-up of the 6 books on this Best Novel shortlist. Hoping to get this posted in advance of the actual Hugo Awards ceremony, so at the time I'm filming this, we don't yet know the winner. But I want to share with you my own ranking of these titles and why I think some of them are more worthy of a Hugo Award than others. So I want to start by talking about Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher, which is my favorite book on this list. It's what I voted for, and also it's the first book on this list I read because this was something that I was very excited for when it was released, and I read it right away last year. This is also the only book on this list that I've talked about already on this channel, so this is going to be a little less of a wrap-up review for this book, but I do want to talk specifically about some of its qualities and why I am rooting for it for the Hugo Award this year. This is a relatively short fairy tale novel that is not a retelling. It follows the quest of a princess named Mara who has lived outside the royal family for some time in a convent on a quest to save her older sister from an abusive husband who is a powerful prince. The beginning of this book is a lot of flashback and backstory, and some of it is very hard-hitting and very dark. And then later, Mara slowly gains allies on her quest, and they murder a prince. There is a demon chicken, there is a bone dog. You may have heard these things, they are true. Here's the thing, this is exactly my type of fiction. This falls very neatly within the canon of literature that has been formative to me in my fantasy reading. I read this and I think of it as a slimmer, more accessible literary descendant of books like Robin McKinley's Deerskin or Juliet Marillier's Daughter of the Forest. This falls firmly within a long, rich tradition of feminist fairy tale fantasy, right? So it's not exceptionally innovative if you know that genre history. However, that is a long and rich tradition of work that has not historically been recognized by the Hugo Awards, at least not in the Best Novel category. And so for me, as a reader, there would be a deep sense of satisfaction in seeing a book like this take home the Best Novel trophy. I would feel like maybe my work as a Hugo voter was finally done, you know? But regardless, this was also the only 5-star read for me on this list, so obviously it's my #1 choice. My #2 choice may surprise some people who know my reading tastes well, and that is Nona the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir. You all may remember that the first 2 books in this series were 3 stars for me, although I think Harrow was a stronger 3 stars than Gideon was, and this series has been growing on me despite having generally all the wrong vibes for my reading taste. This book is so many things that I like in a series that decides to take a sharp turn from book to book. This is a book that gives you a totally different perspective on some minor characters from early in the series. It's a book that gives you a totally different perspective on this absolutely horrifying necromancy space empire that we've been in for the whole series. I think a little bit of my frustration with the early books was that, obviously the necromancy space empire ruled by the immortal guy who has styled himself as God is bad, right? And it took a long time to get to the book where you actually see some of normal-ish life in this world and the resistance to the space empire with all of the necromancy and the undead stuff. But the thing that Tamsyn Muir does as a writer with these books that makes them both very frustrating but also mysterious and intriguing, like you want to figure out what's going on but you are never sure, is the very limited perspective of each of this series' protagonists. Nona is whoever the heck is in Harrow's body right now, and no one knows who that is. Not her, not the people who are taking care of her. She has no memories before the time she seemingly came into being at the end of book 2, and she is kind of a total innocent who knows nothing. And Nona's perspective on life in this, like, absolutely devastated dystopian city at war is kind of both beautiful and heartbreaking. Nona is quote-unquote working as an assistant at this school where she befriends a group of children who have their own perspective on this conflict that Nona doesn't really understand, that as the reader you're piecing it together, and it's kind of tragic. This book made me care deeply about some characters that I had kind of forgotten about from previous books. I will say that I am probably at a disadvantage for having read each of these books so far apart because I've read each of them as they've been nominated for Hugo Awards, and I haven't done any rereads. And because Tamsyn Muir thrives by confusing us on purpose, sometimes it's hard for me to tell which of my confusions are intended confusions and which are things that I might have understood better if I had done some rereading. I did reread just the last few chapters of Harrow to remind myself where exactly things stood at the end of that book, and I am glad I did. This is also the book where we finally get some, like, actual answers about the world building, which I was so grateful for. But those answers are presented in such a way that like, for every answer, I have 3 more questions. Because the interludes that we get here are dreams. And we get them during times in the book where Nona is asleep and dreaming, but then she wakes up and describes her dreams, and the dreams she is describing are not the ones that we have been reading in the interlude chapters. What we're getting is a monologue from John, who is the Emperor, aka God, basically describing how he, a human on Earth as we would recognize it, like a near future Earth, accidentally invented necromancy and destroyed the planet and then founded a space empire and became God. Is that too much spoilers? Should I rephrase that? Basically, these are the flashbacks that finally confirm my hypothesis that the solar system in question is ours. Thank goodness, finally an answer. But it's unclear who he's telling this story to, like, is it Harrow or is it Alecto? And I certainly didn't really figure that out by the end. I have so many more questions. Okay, so the vibes of this book in the early half are very, very different from what we've gotten previously in the series, but in the second half the pace does pick up again some, and we do get some of that, like, extreme graphic necromancy violence and, like, disturbing imagery that put me off Harrow. So this can't be 5 stars for me because of that, and also because I sometimes suspect Tamsyn Muir is just making things more confusing than they need to be just for the heck of it, to, like, watch us squirm. But I did give this 4 stars, which is a higher rating than either of the first 2 books. And honestly, this book is the most innovative speculative fiction on this shortlist by, like, a long shot. So if I were voting based purely on, like, what is pushing the genre forward in interesting new directions, this would be my winner. However, I have said why Nettle and Bone is my winner. This is second. Do I think that realistically this will win? When neither of the first 2 books did, and most, like, diehard fans of this series actually like this significantly less than the first two books. I don't know. I'm not a diehard fan of the series though, and I liked this better than the first two books, so others might have the same experience. My other 4-star read of this list was The Spare Man by Mary Robinette Kowal. I forgot when I sat down and introduced and filmed this video that I have already done a full wrap-up for this book. This was in my reading wrap-up of January 2023. If you want to hear my full thoughts on it, go there. I thought this was a very entertaining, very character-driven sci-fi murder mystery. I really loved reading this book, but then was kind of underwhelmed and frustrated by the resolution of the mystery itself. I think this is actually slightly more my thing than the Lady Astronaut series, of which I've only read the first book. I would absolutely read sequels to this without hesitation, but I don't really see this being a Hugo Award winner this year. If only because most of Mary Robinette Kowal's fans seem to like this less than the Lady Astronaut series, and I don't think it has like any startlingly unique literary merits to put it out ahead of the pack. Next on this list is The Daughter of Dr Moro by Silvia Moreno-Garcia, which I think I would have liked this quite a bit more than I did if it had been my first Silvia Moreno-Garcia book. Because I've read so many of hers, this was underwhelming to me, but I'm still happy to see it on this Hugo shortlist, and I think it holds its own in this lineup. I know this was a surprise for a lot of people to see on this list just because this hasn't been the most rapturously received of Silvia Moreno-Garcia's books, but I will beg everyone to remember that she wasn't actually a very widely read author until Mexican Gothic. And then people have started going back and reading her older books in much larger numbers. Mexican Gothic did make the Hugo long list, not the short list, despite being horror, which really doesn't get a lot of Hugo attention. And then this book is a spin on like a classic work of older science fiction that a lot of the Hugo community is probably going to be very familiar with. So while I was also surprised to see this on the Hugo shortlist this year, when I actually sat down and thought about it, I wasn't shocked. I have never read The Island of Dr. Moreau, and I do not ever intend to. But this book transplants Dr. Moreau to the Yucatan Peninsula in 19th century Mexico and gives him a daughter. Carlotta is one of our two point of view protagonists. We get chapters from her and also chapters from a man named Montgomery who works for her father. Dr. Moreau is a mad scientist cooking up these human-animal hybrids that are meant to be able to serve as laborers, but his progress is slow and he is pressured to be able to prove the worth of the expense of this project to his patron. Carlotta is the more likable protagonist, but she's very naive and very inexperienced. She loves her father, blind to his many faults. And when two young men arrive at this remote estate where she lives, she engages at her father's suggestion in a flirtation with one of them that pretty much everyone reading will be able to tell is a terrible idea. Montgomery is the less likable but more sort of world-wise, world-weary protagonist. And I say he's not likable because he's an alcoholic, he's in a very bad mental place throughout most of the book, and also his thoughts about Carlotta are kind of creepy and inappropriate. He gets himself figured out a bit by the end of the book, and I suppose that's sort of a journey with both of these characters. Carlotta also comes into her own by the end of the story. I struggle a little bit with how to categorize this within speculative fiction. I think it's clearly more science fiction than fantasy, but its science isn't accurate to our scientific understanding today. It's maybe accurate to what people would have thought might be possible at the time the original Island of Dr. Moreau was written. This deals with a number of themes that I found recognizable from other books by Silvia Moreno-Garcia that I've read. There is this theme of female empowerment in a historical setting, this kind of creepy, dark take on eugenics, also a bit of a look at class structure and power. You've got some Mexican history that I was personally relatively unfamiliar with, but I think I've enjoyed the execution of most of these themes more in other books by this author that I've read. Mexican Gothic, Gods of Jade and Shadow, which is why I said that I think I might have been more impressed with this book if this had been the first novel of hers I had read. Despite being the biggest surprise for many people on this Hugo shortlist, I think it holds its own here and it's firmly in the middle of my rankings. And then the last two books on this list, Legends and Lattes and the Kaiju Preservation Society, I ranked in the order I did purely as a matter of personal preference. I think they're a fairly equivalent type of fun escapist read, but for different target audiences. I am personally closer to being the target audience for Legends and Lattes than for the Kaiju Preservation Society, so this is the one that I ranked higher. This is a book that I'm kind of actively frustrated that I waited too long to read, so I had to read it at a time where I was contemplating its worthiness for a Hugo Award instead of having read it already before the shortlist came out. And I think I would have been more generous in my reading of this book had I not been thinking of it as an awards contender. As it was, I gave this 3 stars, which is a big disappointment for me for a book I genuinely hoped to love. And I want to say right off the bat that my feelings that this isn't award-worthy isn't exclusively because it is cozy fantasy. I do appreciate the argument for this inclusion on the shortlist, that this book was such a moment last year. This was a book talk craze that spilled over into wider popularity. It was self-published near the beginning of the year and got picked up for traditional publishing remarkably quickly. And I get the argument that this book's popularity represents, like, the desire for cozy fantasy, the birth of a subgenre that will dominate the industry for years to come, maybe. But I do think cozy SFF had a moment at the Hugo Awards last year, kind of for all of those same reasons, with A Psalm for the Wild-Built, which is cozy science fiction. It won Best Novella, and I would argue is a significantly better book than Legends and Lattes. I still haven't read the second book in that series yet, however. A Psalm for the Wild-Built is a book that digs pretty deep into the philosophy of its coziness, if you will, and ends up having something very deep and profound to say about someone who's done the thing that Viv, the protagonist of this book, does, which is leave it all behind for a very cozy profession, and the search for meaning in that. Where do we find that meaning in our purpose in life? And this book does nothing comparable to that. So this feels like a cozy fiction downgrade in literary merit from last year's cozy fiction on the Hugo Award ballot. And I think last year, A Psalm for the Wild-Built's win really did represent something in the zeitgeist that I think was part of the same movement in the genre that's given rise to cozy fantasy like Legends and Lattes in droves just a year or two later. And just because this book is more popular, I don't think that makes it as award-worthy. This book is kind of a gimmick, and some people are gonna like that gimmick more than others. The gimmick is that this is a D&D inspired fantasy world, I surmise. I don't know D&D. And Viv, who is an orc about whom we have preconceptions because we have D&D stereotypes about orcs, leaves her adventuring days behind her to go to a city where they have never heard of coffee and open a coffee shop. Coffee and espresso are apparently gnomish inventions that she encountered in some other faraway city, but over the course of the book, Viv and co gradually develop this business into something resembling like a modern coffee shop in this very traditional fantasy world. So at one point, like, this young wannabe bard shows up with his lute, and like they arrange that he'll play live music in the coffee shop, and like it turns out that he's invented the electric lute. Like, whoa. They hire a baker who first invents croissants, and then he invents biscotti. Like, this is the entire gimmick. And it is, at times, I will admit, a very cute gimmick. Like, I laughed, I smiled. There is a giant cat, like a dire cat. They feed her milk. I worried she was going to get diarrhea. The, like, threat danger plot, what there is of one, has to do with, on one hand, like, a local neighborhood crime organization that expects Viv to, like, pay a fee to do business in her neighborhood, and she doesn't want to. And then on the other hand, there is a stone that she has because it's like from a magical creature of some sort that she chopped it out of. And the legend of this stone is that it's supposed to bring good luck. And so there are some other people who might want to steal it from her, and she worries about whether or not the success of her business and the new friends that she's made are due only to the presence of the stone. But again, I might make myself sound very ignorant here because I am not a gamer, but like there are video games where the whole plot is about you like starting a business from scratch and watching it grow, or like building a town or a house or whatever. Like, that's the vibe here. That's what this is doing. And what actually frustrated me most about this is that along the way it raises a lot of issues that the book was in no way prepared to delve into in any serious matter. First and foremost is the idea that Viv is an orc in a world where there is prejudice, racial prejudice against orcs. People expect them to be big and brutish and violent, and her assistant, Tandri, who becomes a little bit of a love interest later on, is a succubus, which people expect to be like sexy seductresses. And these two characters kind of defying those racial stereotypes is one of the central big ideas of the book, and there was no nuance there at all. We don't actually get enough granular world building here to have any real idea of what being an orc means to Viv, what it means in this world as opposed to our stereotypical idea of a fantasy world that I think we're supposed to get from D&D, but I don't have that point of reference. And similarly with Tandri being a succubus, we don't see any evidence of like orc or succubus culture or history. We don't get either of these characters ever interacting with others of their kind. They've just sprung fully formed from stereotypes the reader is supposed to have, and I think that's my problem with the whole world of this book too. We're supposed to just understand what this type of fantasy city is, and because we're all supposed to sort of have a common shorthand understanding, then the author sort of neglects to do any actual world building on either like a macro or micro level. Like, it would make sense for this type of book for the world building to all be very micro, all be very detailed and granular. You don't need to know what's going on in the bigger world outside the city or beyond this neighborhood, but you want to have some history, some culture, some tradition, some nuance within the confines of the story, within this city, within this neighborhood, within this group of people. And so the world building all felt very flat to me, almost non-existent. The character work also felt very flat, almost non-existent. Like, these characters didn't have a distinctive voice, either in dialogue or in their thoughts. We didn't really get very much of anyone's backstory or history. I never felt like I got a real sense of who any of the people in this book were. I think what I'm trying to make clear here is that my problems with this book aren't with it being slice of life fantasy. I think there are ways to do slice of life fantasy that has all of that richness and nuance that I crave but wasn't getting here. I also want to point out, I'm not a D&D person. I'm also not a coffee person either. I have never liked coffee. And so as someone who isn't just like personally, emotionally besotted with coffee, like some of the coffee stuff in here didn't make sense to me. Like no one in this book has ever tasted coffee before they experience it at this coffee shop, and Viv gives them the opportunity to try coffee for the first time. Okay, so first of all, no one in this book at any point ever comments on the fact that coffee is a stimulant. Like they notice at a certain point that their coffee shop is more busy in the mornings. No one talks about why, so surprising. You would think you would be selling that as like a selling point of your business, of the drink. The reason people buy coffee, right? At least it's the reason I think people buy coffee, because I don't like the taste. And then second of all, the fact that people seem to like the coffee right away. I know this might be my bias because I've never acquired the taste for coffee, but I do understand it to be, for most people, an acquired taste. Like people start drinking it very young, so like maybe they forget that no one likes coffee the first time they try it as a kid. And yet it's not an acquired taste for anyone in this book. Like they all say, oh, grumbly, roasty bean, you know, stuff sounds gross, and then they sip it and then they like grudgingly admit that it's not bad. No one has a bleh reaction to drinking coffee for the first time. I don't know. I think that if this were, for example, a book about setting up a tea shop in Fairyland as opposed to like a coffee shop in D&D land, like that would be something where I would overlook all of the flaws more than this. I gave this 3 stars. The reason there's still a bookmark in it is I haven't read the short story at the end. I think I still will read the short story at the end. And I will be interested to watch and see what else Travis Baldree publishes from here. Some of the weaknesses here could very easily be just like self-published debut weaknesses. But I don't think this is a Hugo-worthy book, and I don't think it's gonna win. I think that my last place book, which is The Kaiju Preservation Society by John Scalzi, might have a chance of winning, despite the fact that I sort of categorize it in the same boat as Legends and Lattes. I think that is partially because it's more traditional science fiction than most of the stuff on this list, aside from The Spare Man. And also because Worldcon is in China this year, and this is, as far as I know, the only one of these books that's been translated into Chinese. It's the only one that was available in Chinese in the Hugo voter packet. This is also the book that I think I remember the least detail about of all of the books on this list. I did read it at the end of last year before it was on this short list. I got it from the library and I read it while I was traveling for the holidays, and my flights were being canceled right and left, and it was something that like I could consume fairly mindlessly while I was traveling and stressed. And that's honestly like the best thing that I can say to recommend this book, is that it was something that went down tolerably easily on a travel trip, because that's when I have the least mental brain power available to actually like focus on a book. So a book that I read while traveling has to be able to grab me, and also not be something that I have to like really deeply intellectually or emotionally invest myself in. This is about a sort of everyman guy, I think his name is Jamie, who ends up at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, sort of accidentally landing a job with what he later learns is the Kaiju Preservation Society, a secret organization that scientifically monitors goings-on in an alternate world version of Earth populated by kaiju-like monstrous creatures. Life has evolved very differently on this alternate Earth, and the kaiju are basically nuclear-powered, and so the development of nuclear power in our world has caused some disruptions in like the veil between worlds at points in the past, which is why we have the ability to portal to this alternate world, and we have to make sure that none of the kaiju ever like cross over. Jamie is a non-scientist among very smart scientists. He's been hired to basically do like the menial grunt work. He carries things, I think that's the thing he keeps saying. But he has a background in science fiction literature, so he is a self-insert character for a certain type of reader, right? He is out of his depth, but maintains like cocky confidence throughout. He's able to spew like the relevant science fiction genre references. He was not someone I could personally relate to at all. Like, he's a self-insert protagonist for a reader demographic that isn't me. I just think that this book is ultimately no deeper than something like Legends and Lattes, even though it has more action and like more potential for nuclear explosions. The big takeaway, the thesis, the heart and soul of this book is the shocking revelation that billionaires are bad. Which, like, I agree, right? I agree, but it's not much. I think, like Legends and Lattes, this was something that, like, could have gone much deeper psychologically. There was, like, a major character death near the end that everyone were sort of told they were sad about it for a while, and then they brushed it off and got on with the plot. I think we were supposed to care a lot for the sort of eclectic group of scientists that our protagonist befriends, but honestly, I've forgotten who they all were. The characterization there didn't feel really strong. This goes below Legends and Lattes for me for being less my type of fiction, like, generally. But I think these two are fairly equivalent, honestly, and I'm a little bummed by the idea that Kaiju Preservation Society might actually win this year. Like, I'm not mad at anyone who likes this book or gave this book or Legends and Lattes 5 stars. I just don't think they are not my Hugo picks, let's just say that. So that's it. That's my wrap-up and ranking of this year's best novel Hugo nominees. Let me know what you think. Have you read this list of books as well? And if so, do you agree or disagree with my opinions? I hope you're having a very nice day. That is all. Bye for now.